I'm Lauren Taylor. I'm the Senior Program Director at the Hyde Family Foundation, and we're happy to be part of these conversations today. Proud that our foundation invests in ULI Memphis, this gathering and the Planning Matters series. I'm here to introduce our next speaker, as Anna said, Lynn Ross. She's the founder and principal of Spirit for Change, which is a consulting firm dedicated to developing creative solutions for evolving places and people working to serve the common good. Lynn has more than 15 years of experience and passion for housing affordability, city and regional planning, community development, evidence-based policymaking, and organizational change. Leading Spirit for Change, Lynn works nationally and across sectors with organizations on a mission to create and sustain inclusive policies, practices, and places. The practice of Spirit for Change is rooted in a deep belief in diversity, equity, evidence-based decision-making, and asset-based community development. Prior to launching Spirit for Change, Lynn was with the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, where she directed the Community and National Initiatives program. And as CNI's vice president, she led a national team that was focused on expanding talent, opportunity, and engagement in the 26 communities where the Knight brothers once published their newspapers. So today, Lynn continues to work with the Knight Foundation by leading Knight's engagement in a multi-partner $40 million multi-year demonstration, which is called Reimagining the Civic Commons, an initiative we're very familiar with at the foundation and here in Memphis, because our fourth bluff is a Civic Commons site. We're very proud of that. Prior to joining Knight, Lynn served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development in the Office of Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And that's among many other fantastic positions in her career. She's a frequent speaker and award-winning author, and she has a master's in regional planning from Cornell University, a BS in community and regional planning from Iowa State University. I am very much look forward to hearing from her today. So with that, I give you Lynn Ross.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm really delighted to be here in Memphis despite the rain. It was actually good sleeping weather, so thank you for that. I've been on the road for over a week, so you'll have to bear with my voice, but I'm really pumped up about public spaces, and I hope to get you fired up about them too. So today I'm going to talk to you not just about public spaces, but really the power of our civic commons. So now is really a golden moment for cities. We heard this a little bit from the mayor's panel. Ed touched on it as well. But today, 82% of Americans call urban areas home. And this is actually a global trend. So by 2050, the United Nations projects that more people will be calling urban areas home. And places like Africa, China, Latin America, India, they're all urbanizing at really spectacular paces. And here in the US, our Census Bureau projects that our population is going to grow by maybe 80 million people by 2050, and 60 million of those folks are going to live in urban areas. So this is really a golden moment for us. Now, here in the US, this trend has been especially pronounced coming out of the most recent Great Recession. And in fact, since the end of that recession, all of net jobs growth has been in urban areas. So people are flocking there to live, they're flocking there to work. And while they're doing that, they're also demonstrating a real preference for living in walkable, vibrant areas where they can bike and access amenities. And that preference cuts across generations. So whether you're Gen Z or a millennial, a Gen Xer like me, a baby boomer or beyond, people want to live in neighborhoods and communities where they can get to all the things they love to do by walking, biking, or taking transit. So after 40 years of decline, the market is finally moving back towards cities, and that's really exciting. That's the good news. The bad news, however, is that after 40 years of decline in our most dense neighborhoods, after decades of designing gated communities, of prioritizing private rather than shared resources, nearly every trend line, and these days nearly every headline, shows that we are a country in the grips of increased polarization, segregation, social isolation, and economic inequality. We are more segregated by income today than we have been in our entire history. And we know that place deeply impacts equity. Social science researchers tell us that the best opportunities for children in low-income households are to live in economically diverse communities, but we're moving in the opposite direction. The proportion of families who live in either predominantly low-income or predominantly affluent neighborhoods has more than doubled since 1970. And when zip code becomes destiny, we are really failing on achieving the American dream. Now, we're also much less likely to spend time with our neighbors than we used to. So just in my lifetime, the percentage of Americans who report spending time with their neighbors regularly has fallen from nearly 30% in the 70s to just about 20% today. And a third of us, we don't spend time with our neighbors at all, right? Those are just those strangers that live next door to us. I would argue we've designed our communities in ways that make opting out of public life much easier than opting in. And this is at a time when health researchers are pointing to some very direct links between social isolation or loneliness and physical and mental illness, cognitive decline, even premature death. And this issue of social isolation, this too cuts across generations. And in fact, our neighbors in the United Kingdom are so concerned about this trend that they've recently appointed a minister of loneliness to figure out what their national strategy should be on this issue. And while our neighborhoods and the many civic institutions that support them have become more economically segregated, our increasing demographic diversity also challenges our notions of community. Who's in and who's out? And this is driven in large part by the fact that the proportion of our population that is foreign-born is the highest it's been since the 1910s. So these trends of economic and demographic segregation that are pulling us apart geographically and socially, and with very little that pulls us back together, it can feel like trust is really in a free fall amongst people. And in fact, in the 1970s, 50% of Americans reported that they thought most people could be trusted. Today, that number has fallen to just about 30%. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty sad. I also think it's pretty dangerous and scary because I believe that trust is the fundamental building block to our society. It's fundamental to a functioning democracy, it's fundamental to community building, and it's fundamental to the equitable cities and regions that we all care so much about. So this decades-long trend of social and economic fragmentation, it may seem like it's really intractable, something that we can't address. And you may be wondering, why is Lynn up here depressing us with all of these statistics, and what does this have to do with me? Well, I'm here to argue that each of you plays a critical role. You're here today because you care about the city that you live in, you care about this region, and you care about solutions to address these issues. This trust issue, it is the challenge of our time. This is our all hands on deck moment. And the way I see it, your work, whether you're in real estate, municipal government, education, healthcare, something else altogether, your work and expertise is critical to bridging the divides that are really deeply dividing our communities. Our cities have become such fragmented places with the haves and the have-nots living in separate neighborhoods, and along with that, real disinvestment in our public assets that were designed to serve all of us. There's been a great cost to the abandonment of these assets. We can see it in the overgrown ball fields, we can see it in lackluster libraries, we can see it in the playgrounds that are missing swings. But there are also costs that we can't see, and I would argue that those are, in fact, much more profound. When we don't show up in public life, when we don't spend time regularly in the company of our neighbors, in the company of strangers, trust declines. We desperately need institutions, public space, infrastructure, planning and design that bridges those divides. places that bring people of different incomes and backgrounds together, that make it convenient and easy to be in the company of strangers. This is the answer to the challenge of our time, and we need to put every resource in our cities and regions' arsenals to work at addressing this issue, and that includes each of you. Together, we must affirm the power of our civic commons. Now, all across this country, we have civic assets that were meant to be shared public goods. Our parks, our libraries, our waterfronts, our community centers, our trails. And let me be very clear, I'm not arguing for a return to the ways of the past. Too often, many people were excluded from public life. People of color, women, anyone deemed different were excluded. No, what I'm arguing for are 21st century public assets that finally live up to the American ideal that we were all created equally and that we can all experience public life equally. We can reimagine our parks, our trails, our waterfronts, our libraries, our community centers to become places of connection, places of discussion, places of fun, places of bridging divide. These can be places where we're compelled to sit next to someone we don't know on a bench, maybe pet their dog, make comments about the weather. These will be places where our children can meet and play together. These will be places where we can come together and get to know one another and ultimately build trust and empathy that is so sorely missing from so many of our communities today. These will be places where we can live our everyday lives in the company of strangers who have yet to become friends. And places that can form the canvas on which community can be rebuilt and trust can be reformed. So in 2016, a group of 4 national funders got together and we asked ourselves a question. We said, how can we combat some of the trends that I've just outlined? How can we support creating places and spaces that bring people back together and help to build trust? Well, the answer for us is something called Reimagining the Civic Commons. This is a multi-year demonstration that's working in 5 U.S. cities, and the idea here is to connect and revitalize public assets all across this country. So the 4 foundations that you see here, I engage with this work on behalf of the Knight Foundation. We are working with local, on-the-ground teams that are multi-sectors. So we've got municipal leader, we've got arts and culture folks, and importantly, we have neighborhood residents engaged in this work. These are our demonstration cities, and our ultimate ambition is to support cities, not just these 5, but every city, in the collaborative reimagining of their commons. We believe civic commons are critical to city success. They're not an extra, they're not a luxury, they're actually essential to what makes our cities and regions work. We're also interested in this work in changing the way that we think about the commons and the way that we plan and develop the commons. And we're learning some really valuable lessons along the way. So this initiative is a 3-year demonstration. We're just about halfway through, and we've got some really great early lessons that are emerging from this work. And the first of which is that we need to completely rethink the way that we're planning and managing. And instead of thinking of these assets as separate or individual assets, we need to think of them as a set of connected places that are a portfolio. So think about the last time you took a walk or a bike ride. Did you much care who was managing the sidewalk, the street, the park you went to, or the library you went to? No, you were experiencing a seamless public realm, but that's not the way we plan, manage, or operate that realm. And so Civic Commons is really about changing the way that we do that so that we are planning and operating the Civic Commons in the way that the public experiences it, which is to be seamless. Our intention is to influence city leaders just like you with that reimagining, but also to think about how we sustain these civic commons over time. We're not interested in just making capital investments and then walking away. It only works if the civic commons are sustainable and they grow with the community. So each of our demonstration cities is working through their civic commons reimagining, but they're doing it with 4 key outcome areas in mind: civic engagement, socioeconomic mixing, environmental sustainability, and value creation. We think this intentionality is actually quite critical. So each of the projects is different, they're being managed differently, and that's good. There need to be multiple models for how we do this, but we think there's got to be real intention towards these 4 outcome areas to drive the civic commons. And so my time with you is limited today, but I want to give you a sense of how these outcome areas are actually working on the ground. So I'm going to share 2 examples from our demonstration cities. So through this work, we're really working to build a sense of community that brings people of all backgrounds together, not just as users of their civic commons, but as advocates and stewards, really co-creators of this space. And again, I think if we want to address some of the big challenges of our time, whether it's poverty or equity or resilience, you name it, it has to start with trust and reforming that. And we think the best way to do that is to bring people together, not online, not digitally, but in physical spaces where they can do that. So what does that look like on the ground? Well, one example comes from Detroit. So in Detroit, investment in the Fitzgerald neighborhood is turning vacancy into an asset and a new model for neighborhood redevelopment across the city. Vacant lots are being turned into a park and a greenway, along with a series of neighborhood hubs for smaller scale neighborhood development. The commercial corridor is also being revitalized with retail uses, as well as a neighborhood hub that will be home to some design services, as well as some city services and public programming. Now, the Detroit team realized pretty early on that their traditional methods of civic engagement, of outreach, really weren't working. They weren't getting to the people who lived in the Fitzgerald neighborhood. And so they knew they needed to change what they were doing. So the team decided to get really focused on meeting people where they are, quite literally. Strategies like informal community meetings in the parks and vacant spaces where the development will actually take place have really helped bring in a broader range of Fitzgerald neighborhood residents to engage in the process, as have pop-up events. So some people happen to be walking by, they see a new or interesting activity in this space, and they stop long enough to find out what's going on, to participate, to figure out how they can engage in the work more deeply. And what's great about this is that residents see early action in the space, right? So it's not just come to a meeting, we're going to talk about something that might happen at some point in the future. The activity is underway and they can immediately plug in. So for instance, last spring, there was an activity set up in one of the vacant lots that was really designed for all ages. It included spoken word, there was a Zumba instructor and a hustle instructor who got everyone on their feet, from neighborhood residents to community leaders to nearby university residents to developers. And having everyone move to the same beat, even just for a moment, provided a real point of connection across divides. And when you do activities like this with intentionality over time, it becomes the basis for trust. We also have neighborhood leaders like Stephanie Harbin, who you see there in the blue, who are working with their neighbors to reimagine those neighborhood hub areas that I mentioned. So we've got folks like Mike Dones here, who's watering his garden. Mike took over one of the many vacant lots in the Fitzgerald neighborhood that was sitting next to his home, and he's turned it into this absolutely amazing community garden called the MoFlo Community Garden. I highly recommend you visit if next time you're in Detroit. Now, the Civic Commons process supports folks like Stephanie and Mike by providing micro grants. So this is not a bunch of national foundations coming in to drive it. It's not even just about the local teams driving it. We're really trying to empower folks like Mike and Stephanie who have deep connections to their community to be able to do things like this that are authentic and homegrown, but we also want to help them make it sustainable with these micro grants. So these two-way, in-person, very active forms of engagement allow people to both see and be the change in their community, to start to envision something new, and then to help build that future together. This process clearly borrows from design thinking and tactical urbanism, if you're familiar with that, but it goes beyond because we're using this approach to think about longer-term investment and longer-term plans. In reimagining the Civic Commons model, the pop-ups and the prototypes are the avenue for engaging people into generating that trust, in part because it offers tangible solutions at a speed that the community wants to move. So when you tie this approach with those longer-term investments in planning, this way of working has the potential to engage those residents over time. We all know how long planning and development can take. We have to create a process where residents can both plug in early, but stay along with us in the long haul. And we found this approach really works well to do that. Now, in Detroit, the Civic Commons team is convened by the city's Planning and Development Department. But this has really created a new way of working because this team has brought together a number of multi-sector stakeholders. And the geographic focus of the neighborhood they're working in means that multiple City of Detroit departments, as well as other partners, can really get focused and figure out how to work together. This has become a new way of working for the city. Previously, very siloed. This planning department actually didn't exist until 3 years ago. So it's a new team that's being built, and this is an effort for them to really figure out the way they're going to work, not only in Fitzgerald, but also in the other Detroit neighborhoods that need to be redeveloped. So this is a model that's translating into other activities in the city. And it's also translating into that neighborhood hub that I mentioned earlier. So this is a space that's going to be called Home Base. It's on one of the key commercial corridors immediately adjacent to the Fitzgerald neighborhood. And when it's complete a little later this year, Home Base will be the home for Live 6, which is an emerging CDC in the neighborhood, for the Detroit Collaborative Design Center, which is a nearby university-based design firm. They will operate here, and this will also be home to a number of City of Detroit staff. So instead of asking these residents to travel all the way to City Hall to meet with their planner, their houser, someone in social services, they'll be able to come right across the street from their neighborhood to Home Base. This space will also be open to the public. One of the first things we heard from neighborhood residents is, we don't have a community center. This was a community that actually didn't have a Civic Commons. And so they said, can we have a space that we can partially program where we can meet? And so Home Base will also serve that purpose. So this is going to be a permanent space in this neighborhood where folks can come together and really plan what their collective future should be and build it together. So it's really exciting. So we also want to create places, again, that bring folks together, but that are also incredibly welcoming to new people who are coming in. So let's go to Akron, Ohio next. And in Akron, the Civic Commons team is making investments in 3 pretty distinct neighborhoods along the Ohio and Erie Canal towpath trail that connects them. So temporary and permanent design features, as well as regular programming, are going to reestablish Summit Lake as a place of play and of civic pride. They're going to bridge diverse neighborhoods in between, and then they're also going to help foster a new type of economic development and public life in Akron downtown. So let me give you a little bit of a deep dive into the work at Summit Lake, because I think it's really representative of what we're trying to do with Civic Commons. So Summit Lake sits just 2 miles south of downtown. So if you're on the towpath trail, this is a quick 15-minute walk or bike ride. And this is a 100-acre, positively glacial lake. And in the 1920s, when this picture was taken, Summit Lake was really the playground for Akron's wealthy. There was an amusement park on the banks, and each year, thousands of people would come to boat, to swim, to picnic. Now, if you know anything about Akron, you may know that they were home to the rubber industry for many years. And so there was a lot of pollution that went into Summit Lake. And so over the years, it became a place that people just did not go to. They felt that the water was polluted. And not surprisingly, the neighborhood around Summit Lake also experienced decades of disinvestment and real isolation. So when the Akron Civic Commons team decided that Summit Lake should be a Civic Commons site, they knew they had to expand their core team. It had to include residents and neighborhood leaders from Summit Lake. And so they did exactly that. And over the last 18 months, we've seen some real improvements. So this is all based on community listening sessions and having those Civic Commons leaders from Summit Lake as part of the team. And so previously, if you visited Summit Lake, there was one very sad bench that looked away from the water. And folks said, we want to be able to go to Summit Lake and we just want to be able to sit down and have some shade. We want to be able to grill. This is really our backyard. And so some of the first things that were installed there are the tables that you see. There are new benches along Summit Lake. They've actually built out a little beach area nearby so folks can get very close to the water. There's also kayaking and canoeing going on, as well as fishing lessons for the children. So they're really seeing some early results here, both in the increase in the number of visitors to Summit Lake, but also an increase in the diversity of visitors to Summit Lake. So here's one of those cute children fishing, which is very exciting. And so we had a great experience in Akron last September that I think really encapsulates all four of those outcome areas: value creation, environmental sustainability, civic engagement, and socioeconomic mixing. So all of the Civic Commons team were in town, so there were about 75 of us, and they said, we're going to go down to Summit Lake and we are going to have a special dinner with neighborhood residents. So we sat at a 200-foot table that sort of wrapped around the coastline of Summit Lake, and we broke bread together. It was very simple. But it was very powerful because that is really what this work is about. Can we just sit down and break bread with strangers and get to know one another in this common space? And it was really one of the most powerful experiences I've had doing this work for the last 20 years or so. And you may think, again, that dinner, that seems like a really simple idea, but when you engage in activities like this with intention over time, trust gets reformed, right? So the people sitting at this table had a chance to just talk to each other as neighbors, as human beings, and really think about how they feel about their community, how they feel about this shared public space of Summit Lake. And it was really a beautiful experience. So long-term investments are also shaping up in Akron. And as I said, this work is really about changing the way people do their work. And one great example of that is that the county-wide park system, Summit Metro Parks, has typically been very focused on their suburban parks. But for the first time, they are focused on an urban park. And so they were responsible for the pop-up nature center that I mentioned, and they're now taking over the pump house, which is right at Summit Lake, and it's going to become a permanent home for Summit Metro Parks at Summit Lake. They're going to be able to have a permanent home for their nature-based programming, which was something else that the neighbors really wanted. So we are really delighted by the work that's going on both in Detroit and Akron because it's very authentic to each of those communities. It's about changing the way we do work, but this is all done with the community right along as co-creators. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking more about this idea of changing the way that we do business. As I said, we've been at this for about 18 months. We are learning some real lessons about the work that we're doing. And in partnership with the teams in the 5 cities, we've distilled what we've learned down into 9 working principles for reimagining the Civic Commons. And so the first, as I alluded to, is that we've got to completely rethink the way that we're designing, managing, and operating. This idea of silos is a thing of the past. We know what that looks like. It doesn't work. So we need to plan and manage our civic commons in the way that people experience the civic commons, which is to be seamless. So we've got to think multi-sector, we've got to think multi-departmental, and we've got to really figure out that collaboration, not just within cities, but across regions as well. We also have to create spaces that bring people of all backgrounds together. And so here, we actually have to get beyond just doing big events that do that, and we've got to focus in on those everyday moments that, again, make it easier to opt into public life than what we're doing now, which is to opt out. We also want to make sure that we're amplifying stewards and advocates. So as I said, this work for us is really about daylighting that leadership that already exists in your neighborhoods, in your regions, of people who are deeply connected to their neighborhood, to public space. Can we find new ways to elevate that passion and bring them along as co-creators of this space? We also have to think about providing the best quality for all. We know that our public spaces are in direct competition with things that are available on the private market. But the reality is everybody deserves beauty. Everybody deserves quality. Just because something is public doesn't mean it should be less than. It should be just as good, maybe even better. We also have to remember that our cities, our regions are dynamic places. So while it's important that our civic commons serve existing residents, serve local businesses, we've got to be welcoming to the newcomers that are going to arrive as well. And so we've got to think outside the box about how to preserve culture and preserve what our existing residents find so valuable, but also welcoming in those new voices to our communities. We also want to think about increasing access to nature. So this both means we need to bring people to the nature, but sometimes we need to bring the nature to the people. Just because someone has access to a park or a public space doesn't mean they feel like it's for them. And so we've got to, again, think outside of the box about how we're bringing people to these spaces. We also need to pay special attention to supporting walkability, bikeability, and access to transit. A lot of folks want to arrive to their public spaces in that way. And so we need to think about how we can encourage that behavior, because frankly, we all need to see more of it in our regions. We also want to provide ecological benefits, and I think this was touched on a little bit earlier. All of our civic commons need to be doing at least double time. So we think the civic commons need to be part of your green infrastructure solution. So let's think about that wherever and whenever we can and incorporate that. So again, we're making sure that these commons live up to that outcome of environmental sustainability by being as green and resilient as possible. We also have to think about attracting additional investment. We know that public spaces create value. We've got to think about that, however, in the context of the neighborhood, both residents and local businesses. We don't want to encourage green gentrification here. We want the existing residents and local business to actually benefit from the creation of that value, but we also know we need to attract that new investment because these things don't pay for themselves and they don't pay for themselves over time. So we've got to be very thoughtful and intentional about the way that we are doing that. And finally, we need to measure outcomes that matter. So at the top of this talk, I outlined some pretty serious negative trends that we're all living with right now. I think that our civic commons are part of the solution to addressing those trend lines, but we've got to be able to tell not just an anecdotal story about the power of parks and libraries and waterfronts, we've got to be able to tell an evidence-based, data-driven story. So we've got to measure things that help us make that case. In the past, we've looked at things like books in circulation for a library. Well, that's not a metric that's particularly meaningful for the kinds of transformation that we're talking about and that we're trying to do. So we've got to look at a set of metrics that really drive the conversation and make the case for the power of the commons. And so I shared examples from 2 of our other cities, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk briefly about what's going on in this great city and region. So here in Memphis, the Fourth Bluff project is going on, and it's really exciting. If you don't know about it, I just want to point out Maria Furman over there. She's raising her hand. Get to know Maria. She can tell you all about it. But this team's work is really focused on a set of assets along the Mississippi River. So the Fourth Bluff project reconceives the historic Cossett Library, the Riverline Trail, Memphis Park, and Mississippi River Park into places where all Memphians and all in this region can come together and appreciate nature and appreciate one another. These are going to be places that bring people back together to reestablish trust, reestablish that empathy. The Fourth Bluff is about all of you. It's for all of you, but it needs all of you to engage in the work. And so I want to encourage you and charge you when you leave this conversation today to, if you're not already engaged, get engaged in that work. There's a Fourth Bluff website where you can learn a lot more, as well as on social media. And of course, Maria is here as your expert to tell you more about that work. So I want to leave you with a quote and a question. So the quote is from a very dear friend of mine and mentor and someone very familiar to all of you, Mitch Silver. And Mitch reminds us, I think, of something really important. You know, most of us have homes to go to, and yes, we do a certain amount of activities in our homes, but we really live in public spaces, and we've got to remember that. That's where we experience the richness of our lives. And so the question I want to leave you with is, do you believe in the power of our commons? Because if you do, we need you. Thank you. So I think we've got time for a few questions, and I think there are some mics that are going to be floating around the room. Any questions? I've stunned you into silence? Yes, ma'am. Sure. Actually, I'm going to have that mic go right to Maria. It's right behind you.
And actually, we do have a website, thefourthbluff.com, and that shows some of the renderings of the projects that will soon be. You'll very soon see some dirt moving. Lynn said we're about halfway, 18 months in. We've got 18 months to go, and we've been very focused on really getting some construction underway. But Mississippi River Park, that's the park on the riverfront next to the Tennessee Welcome Center. There's some really exciting plans for some interesting play areas there. And, really the Civic Commons was, it's kind of the start of the bigger riverfront concept plan that the mayor's talked about. It's like the area we call the Fourth Bluff. It's a kind of sleepy area, and kind of the north part of downtown in general is, especially after 5 o'clock, it's like they roll the streets up. So we're really trying to create public life where there was very little before. But I think it's a very important area because we've got activity to the south with Tom Lee Park and Big River Crossing, and then to the north on Mud Island at Greenbelt Park and the new Confluence Park, Wolf River Greenway. So I think, we're sitting right in the middle of that, and, breathing some life into this area with great design and activities and programming will really provide greater continuity along the riverfront, reasons to keep going, more to see, more to do. And, we're really excited about Cossett Library. What we're currently focused on is the mid-century modern edition, which is the newer part of the library. The second floor has been closed for a long time. And our theory about what we want Cossett to be is we really want Cossett to be a place where we cultivate local talent. The second floor is going to have some infrastructure similar. If you've been to Cloud 901 at the main library, we'll have performance areas that are flexible. We will have some recording studios. And then on the first and second floor, there'll be some quiet places for meetings. We'll still have a collection, but this library is not going to be a quiet place. It's going to be a place to meet up. It's going to be a place to have meetings. We are looking for a cafe operator. We're going to have a little food and beverage component. Something we've heard a lot just from talking about people that live and work downtown and adjacent to downtown is, I want somewhere I can go where I can buy a cup of coffee, but I don't have to stay and to use the space. So I guess just in following us on social, I think that's where we put most of our ongoing activities. And right now, we're trying really hard to keep active and keep a presence while the library's closed for renovation and while things are about to get underway in the parks. But we're doing little activations, and we partner a lot with Downtown Memphis Commission, and they do a great job programming downtown and just making it a vibrant and fun place to live and work.
Are you building in commercial? One problem I have when I go downtown.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Well, I'll say, we will have a little food and beverage component at Cossett, and I think some plans for Beale Street Landing are going to be to have some food and beverage. And then, I think there's infrastructure all along the riverfront for, the mobile vending, retail as well as food and drink. When you say commercial, let's remember the Fourth Bluff area is the promenade, so there is, it's been set aside for public space. It can't be all commercial development, but I think, that it's agreed upon that there's nothing wrong with having a component, that is commercial and does offer, food and drink. But I think and we really do go along with that ethos that this is for the public, this is for everybody. But yes, and I agree, there's a particular place on the riverfront where I've asked, can I please have a water fountain here? This is where I get, and I'm about to die. I'm about to pass out, and then there's nothing to drink. Yeah, something like to sit and buy and enjoy the river. But I think, between Beale Street Landing and Cosset, hopefully we'll start to fill in some of those gaps of where you can get something to eat and drink. And some shade. Shade's important too.
Thanks, Maria. Other questions? Yes, we've got one way in the back there.
Thank you for being here. I am interested in hearing how, as you develop the Civic Commons, how you take into consideration these cities that have high poverty populations, and how you make sure that there are places that you don't have to have a deep pocket to enjoy free offerings and activities, and places where you won't get put out of that place for being there too long. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I can tell you, in all of the communities that we're working in, we are typically out in neighborhoods that have had years of disinvestment. So I talked about Akron, I talked about Detroit. This is also true in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is working in 5 neighborhoods across the city that have experienced serious disinvestment over the years. So these are not the places where sort of everything's going on already. These are places sometimes where there are no civic commons and we're creating it, but in other places where the civic commons has sort of been left by the wayside. So the work that we're doing is first and foremost for those community members. Others will come and they'll be welcome to it, but the spaces are open to the public. The programming, by and large, is completely free of charge, and that's by design. So we're doing that in this process, but we're also looking to have that continue as the Civic Commons truly gets turned over to these cities. When the demonstration ends, the Civic Commons and the spirit behind it will remain. And so these are meant to be places for everyone. That is the fundamental ethos of what we're trying to do here. There are many other places you can go that are private or that require some sort of cost. We've got to reinvest in those spaces that are truly for all, where all you have to do is be a human being or a pet and show up to enjoy that space. Other questions? Oh, we are out of time, so no more questions. Thank you, everybody.